It was a cold winter evening in 1982 on Long Island, New York. The kind of night when people wanted to stay inside where it was warm. But at Mel's Diner on Highway 25, business was still busy even though it was getting late. The bright neon sign outside flickered against the dark sky, welcoming customers who were looking for a hot meal and a warm place to sit. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was lively and cheerful. More than 70 people filled the red vinyl booths and counter stools. Families were finishing their dinners, couples shared dessert, and groups of friends laughed over coffee. The waitresses moved quickly between tables, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates. The kitchen was still busy, with the sounds of sizzling burgers and clinking dishes filling the air. Regular customers knew this place well. It was the kind of family restaurant where everyone felt safe and welcome. Parents brought their children here for weekend treats. Workers stopped by after long shifts. Elderly couples came for their weekly date nights. The diner had been part of the community for years, and people trusted it as a safe haven. But on this particular night, that sense of safety was about to be shattered forever. At exactly 10:47 p.m., the front door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall. The cheerful chatter and clinking of silverware stopped instantly. Every head turned toward the entrance, and what people saw made their blood run cold. 5 men dressed in dark clothes stood in the doorway. Each one held a gun, and their faces were covered with masks. They moved with the confidence of people who had planned this moment carefully. These weren't desperate amateurs, they were organized criminals who knew exactly what they were doing. "Nobody move," the leader shouted, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "This is a robbery. Everyone stay exactly where you are, and no one gets hurt." The customers froze in terror. Children started crying. Some people dropped their forks, the metal clanging loudly on their plates. A few customers instinctively reached for their phones, but the gunmen were watching for any movement. "Hands where we can see them," another attacker yelled. "Anyone who tries to be a hero will regret it." The 5 men spread out across the diner with military-like precision. They had clearly studied the layout beforehand. One man blocked the front door. Another positioned himself near the kitchen to prevent anyone from escaping through the back. The other 3 began moving between the tables, their guns pointed at the terrified customers. The robbery began immediately. The gunmen demanded wallets, purses, jewelry, watches, anything valuable. They weren't gentle about it. They roughly grabbed bags from women's hands and yanked necklaces from around people's necks. Some customers tried to hide their wedding rings, but the attackers were thorough and ruthless. "Empty your pockets. All of them," they commanded. "We want everything, your money, your credit cards, your jewelry. Don't try to hide anything from us." An elderly man tried to keep his wallet hidden, but one of the robbers noticed and struck him with the handle of his gun. The old man fell to the floor, blood running from a cut on his forehead. His wife screamed and tried to help him, but the gunman pushed her back into her seat. The attackers moved from table to table like wolves hunting prey. They took a young mother's purse while her baby cried in the high chair beside her. They ripped the watch off a businessman's wrist so roughly that it left marks on his skin. A teenage girl begged them not to take her grandmother's ring, but they ignored her tears. The restaurant workers weren't spared either. The waitresses had to hand over their tip money from the whole night's work. The cook was forced to open the cash register and give them every dollar inside. Even the dishwasher had to empty his pockets. For nearly an hour, the 5 men continued their systematic robbery. They collected thousands of dollars in cash, jewelry, and credit cards. But then, just when everyone thought the nightmare was almost over, something changed in the atmosphere. The attackers looked at each other with a kind of silent communication that made everyone's fear grow even deeper. "This isn't finished," the leader announced in a cold voice that made everyone's skin crawl. What happened next was so horrific that many survivors would spend years in therapy trying to recover from it. The gunman ordered all the customers and workers to move to the back of the restaurant. They forced everyone to remove their clothes, threatening to shoot anyone who refused or tried to resist. The humiliation was unbearable. Families were separated. Parents tried desperately to shield their children's eyes. Elderly customers were forced to strip in front of strangers. The attackers seemed to enjoy the power they had over these innocent people. But the horror didn't stop there. At gunpoint, the criminals forced their victims to perform degrading acts that violated their dignity in ways that words can barely describe. The psychological damage from that night would last far longer than any physical injuries. Some people tried to comfort each other quietly, whispering words of support and encouragement. Parents held their children close, trying to provide what little protection they could. But everyone knew they were completely helpless against 5 armed men who seemed to have no limits to their cruelty. The attack continued for hours. By the time it finally ended, every person in that diner had been changed forever. The attackers finally left sometime after 2 a.m., disappearing into the dark night and leaving behind a scene of devastation and trauma. The first police car arrived within minutes of the emergency call. Officers found customers and workers in various states of shock, some still unable to speak about what had happened. Ambulances rushed to the scene to treat people who had been physically injured, but everyone there needed help dealing with the emotional trauma. The story spread quickly across Long Island and then throughout New York. Local newspapers ran front-page stories about the attack. Television news crews set up outside the diner, reporting on what many called one of the most brutal crimes in the area's history. The community was outraged. How could something so terrible happen in their peaceful neighborhood? Parents became afraid to take their families out to eat. Business owners worried about the safety of their customers and employees. Everyone wanted justice for the victims. Police Detective Sarah Martinez was assigned to lead the investigation. She had worked on many difficult cases before, but this one affected her deeply. "I've never seen anything quite like this," she told reporters. "The level of violence and cruelty was beyond anything we usually deal with." The investigation began immediately. Detectives interviewed each of the 73 victims, carefully collecting their statements and descriptions of the attackers. It was slow, difficult work because many people were too traumatized to talk in detail about what had happened. Crime scene investigators spent days at the diner, collecting fingerprints, DNA evidence, and any other clues the attackers might have left behind. They found several important pieces of evidence, including fingerprints on the cash register and DNA samples from items the criminals had touched. Meanwhile, police officers canvassed the neighborhood, talking to anyone who might have seen something suspicious that night. They checked security cameras from nearby businesses and interviewed taxi drivers and delivery workers who had been in the area. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later. A fingerprint found at the scene matched someone in the police database, a man named Robert Chen, who had a history of armed robbery. This led police to his known associates, and within days they had identified all 5 attackers. The arrests happened quickly after that. Police surrounded the apartment where Chen was staying and took him into custody without incident. The other 4 men were arrested within 48 hours at various locations around the city. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Besides the physical evidence from the crime scene, several victims were able to identify the men in police lineups. The attackers had also been careless with some of the stolen credit cards, using them at stores that had security cameras. The legal case that followed was one of the largest in the county's history. The 5 men were charged with a total of 819 separate crimes, including armed robbery, assault, kidnapping, and numerous other serious charges. Each count represented a crime against an individual victim. The trial lasted for months. One by one, survivors took the witness stand to tell their stories. It was incredibly difficult for them to relive that terrible night, but they were determined to see justice done. Many spoke about how the attack had changed their lives, some had moved away from the area, others still had nightmares, and many needed ongoing therapy. The defense lawyers tried various strategies to reduce the charges, but the evidence was too strong and the victim's testimony too powerful. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges for all 5 defendants. During sentencing, the judge spoke directly to the attackers. "Your crimes that night went far beyond simple robbery. You violated the basic human dignity of 73 innocent people. You turned what should have been a safe, pleasant evening into a nightmare that will haunt your victims for the rest of their lives." Each of the 5 men received prison sentences ranging from 45 to 60 years. With no possibility of parole for at least 30 years, they would all spend the majority of their remaining lives behind bars. The diner eventually reopened 6 months later, but it was never quite the same. The community had been forever changed by what happened that night. However, the way people came together to support the victims and demand justice also showed the strength and resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Today, nearly 4 decades later, the case is still remembered as a reminder of both the worst and best of humanity, the capacity for terrible evil, but also the power of a community to stand together and fight for justice.